The N64 showed us what true 3D gaming was all about. The Pokémon craze exploded, and we all went crazy over Lara Croft's triangles? Press the Z button on subscribe and find out why we're obsessed with 1996.
It's me, Mario!
Mario 64 was Mario's big foray into 3D gaming. And 3D gaming had existed before it, but this was like the best platformer in the world is going to try 3D and do their take on it. And everyone was super pumped for it. It was a huge deal. And I think it's safe to say that they set the standard for where 3D gaming was going to go going forward.
The launch of the N64 was a big moment for Nintendo. I mean, the PS1 and the Sega Saturn were already on the market, proving that there was a space for consoles that could do 3D graphics. So Nintendo really had to push to make the launch of the N64 special. And the launch of the N64, you had other games, Pilot Wings really, but it launched with the big boy, the big guy, the guy we're talking about right now, Mario 64, which kind of proved that the N64 had a place in the market.
I remember seeing this game at Blockbuster, if you can remember what Blockbuster is. And it was like a demo for it, and it looked like the future. It was absurd, the 3D, and it was insane. You couldn't believe it. It was Mario in 3D. It was Mario in real life. If you can believe that N64 games looked like real life at any point. But there wasn't anything like it. Especially for console gamers, this was something brand new, something exciting, something that we've never seen before.
The N64 controller looked like this, and the main way you moved around was with this, the analog stick. Something that was specifically designed for Mario 64. I mean, you could move in all directions with this analog stick. And yeah, it feels kind of cheap and plasticky today, but at the time, that was pretty revolutionary. It gave Mario 64 this really grand scope and sense of freedom that no other 3D game really had at that time.
Mario introduced some collectathon elements. I think they were around before this, but you could tell from a 3D perspective, it's nice to have things for the character to jump to find throughout the journey, to make the level design more interesting. They can put little nooks and crannies here and there. Mario 64 capitalized on that in a big way, and they showed that you could have these big worlds and fill it with stuff to do. And you'll see like Banjo-Kazooie and all those other games take that many steps further, but this was a big starting point for that kind of concept.
The impact of Mario 64 going forward is the impact of 3D gaming. Without Mario 64, honestly, a lot of the games that we know and love probably wouldn't exist. 3D platformers, 3D adventure games, 3D sandbox games. I mean, in many ways, Mario 64 was the first open sandbox game that was really marketed really hard and really worked. And that era. So without Mario 64, buy sandbox games, buy 3D platformers, like buy an entire genre of gaming, a type of gaming. The worlds in Mario 64 felt so alive and tangible. As silly as it is, like without Mario 64, we wouldn't have something like Red Dead Redemption, these really open, breathable worlds. Quake is a 3D shooter from id Software. It is one of their more notable titles, being a very early example of a 3D first-person shooter. And Quake was special for the time because a lot of games were stuck as what they call Doom, clones, which is also something that id coined, was Doom. But Quake kind of took what they learned from that game and really advanced it into the third dimension. And it was, just on a technical scale, very impressive.
First-person shooters weren't what they are today at that time in 1996. First-person shooters had were basically exclusively PC for the most part. I think there were some attempts before that, but they just were nightmarishly bad. So this was a PC realm, and first-person shooters, prior had been... earlier we had Doom, but we were starting to move into the more 3D, exciting, fast-paced era that were more of what we're used to now.
And as a follow-up to Doom, it did everything it needed to do correctly. I mean, Doom was already such a landmark title for first-person shooters and also 3D gaming that Quake kind of took everything they had pre-established with Doom and took it to the next level. To where if you look at Doom and Quake back to back, it looks like Doom came out decades before Quake. It's that noticeable, but really like 3D graphics and gaming and like that space they were just progressing rapidly throughout the 90s.
PC gaming in 96 was a lot different than console. They were very, very different experiences. I know now they've homogenized a lot, but back then PC gaming and console gaming were almost there was no overlap almost. It was games that were made for PC were made for keyboard and mouse, and games that were made for console were made for controllers. And they operated on completely different wavelengths. And I think it was safe to say that PC gaming at the time was much higher end, spec-wise.
Quake also kind of invented the idea of the arena shooter. I don't want to say it invented entirely, but maybe popularized the idea of the arena shooter. I mean, first-person shooters that could go online that were arena-based and really were multiplayer-based. I feel like a lot of people probably knew Quake more for that multiplayer aspect than they did the main campaign. And it was such a popular thing within Quake that later on they would just make a game called Quake Arena.
Quake today it's more of a legacy thing. It's inspired so much. Everything is Quake inspired at this point, for one reason or another. You'll see its DNA everywhere in terms of arena shooters, the more Twitch shooters that you might see. That stuff is from Quake. Mods, everything has like a root in Quake. I'm sure anybody that makes a game now that's a first-person shooter, you can trace some of what they're doing back to this game.
Parappa the Rappa was a PlayStation 1 game about a talking dog that rapped his way through everyday life and trivial activities. It was a pioneer in the rhythm game genre. Artist Rodney Greenblatt designed the characters for the game, and it had such a goofy style and memorable characters that it left a lasting impression on PlayStation audiences. And Parappa the Rappa himself is often seen as one of the most iconic PlayStation characters of all time.
Tomb Raider was an action game, one of the early ones that explored the 3D space, and it featured Lara Croft, who everyone knows is like a sex icon in gaming. And this was back when it was just polygons, so it was very titillating to see. But the other thing it's less, I guess it'd be more infamous for, is for its awful controls that are now basically unplayable, but at the time they're still trying to figure things out. So that's what Tomb Raider is in a nutshell.
Adventure games before Tomb Raider were pretty limited. I mean, just games before 3D gaming in general, kind of, you were limited on how much you could really do within that space. So making an adventure game, you had a few choices. You had like text-based adventures, you had top-down adventures like The Legend of Zelda, but you couldn't really get that true freedom. And Tomb Raider was special because the adventure game genre and the advent of 3D gaming went hand in hand, and this is like the showpiece.
The controls are tanky. They're very abysmal. They're like you have to move left, right, forward, back. It wasn't meant to be played on a DualShock because I don't even think those existed. And on the Genesis there wasn't that. Wherever is this first from? Saturn? I don't remember. This was on some Sega thing first too. So it didn't even have that. So that navigation through 3D didn't exist, and their guns, she shot them forward. It was very, very awkward. It controlled terribly. I think even at the time, people probably felt that way, but they didn't have anything else, so just kind of got to deal with it.
Lara Croft is one of the most iconic characters of the 1990s. I mean, just going on sex appeal alone, of course, people are going to point at Lara Croft. She was in like Playboy magazines and stuff. You know, it was very risque. But also, just Lara as a character is so interesting because female characters up until Tomb Raider were pretty paint by the numbers. Sure, you had some characters in fighting games that stand out like Chun-Li, but a lot of characters in gaming were the damsels in distress. There weren't really a lot of badass characters. And Lara Croft was a badass character. She wasn't a damsel, she wasn't out for revenge, she didn't have some crappy plot like the reboot Tomb Raiders did recently. No, Lara Croft did what she did in the original games because she was a fucking badass bitch and that's what she wanted to do. She felt like she wanted to get some fucking riches, you know? It's just like, it was as simple as that, and that's all it needed to be, and that made the character so lovable and, you know, such a fun character to follow.
Graphically, this is a mixed bag. So it was cool to see a world in 3D like this, and the environments looked okay, and they looked pretty good. But I think what most people are drawn to is the character design. Lara Croft has these triangles right here, and it became it's like a meme in gaming, but it is reflective of the culture, I suppose.
Tomb Raider was actually supposed to be a Sega Saturn exclusive. Don't tell the PlayStation fans. And it did come out on the original Sega Saturn, and it is notable for being one of the best examples of 3D on the original Sega Saturn. But of course, you know, the popularity of the PlayStation kind of shifted the franchise's focus after Tomb Raider 1 to be mainly a PlayStation franchise, and that's what it's more closely associated now. But I like to think that, like, in some weird, bizarre time flux where the Saturn was more successful, that Tomb Raider would have been more associated with Sega. Resident Evil is Capcom's horror baby. It is a game that was inspired by an old Capcom game called Sweet Home and took notes from a previous horror game called Alone in the Dark, but really like magnified what a horror game could really be. You know, there were examples before Resident Evil. I'm not going to call it the first horror game. There were games like Clock Tower and Alone in the Dark, but Resident Evil kind of took everything that worked within the horror genre and put it into a video game, and there's a reason why today it's still Capcom's biggest franchise outside of Monster Hunter.
Horror games at the time were very limited. Graphics weren't so great that you could have these spooky, like gut scary images. So a lot of it was text, and a lot of it was very cartoonish. So to have a game come out that's more realistic, more the horror that you would see in a movie, was very, very new.
Pre-rendered graphics are special, especially around this time, because it allowed a lot of games with stationary backgrounds like Resident Evil or Final Fantasy or hell, even Mario Party, to take advantage of an art style that would look a lot better than if they rendered all of the backgrounds in 3D in real time. Pre-rendered just makes everything look really good for the time. It looks really good on like a CRT TV, and it doesn't translate as well nowadays. I know some games try to emulate that style, but really, like, pre-rendered graphics worked well for the technology at the time in that setting. If you try to play something like this game today through like the PlayStation 5 port of the PS1 version on a modern display, the pre-rendered graphics are not going to look as good as they used to.
The voice acting is famously bad, but it almost works to its credit. It's like part of the charm. If you need to just go back and listen to the clips. There's many YouTube channels that will show you many of these clips, so you should just go listen to those. and they're legendary, and not only how bad they're delivered, but how bad they're written. Like, it was very, very clear that there was an issue with the translation. Obviously, this is a Japanese game, so to see it come out like that is an early lesson, and it pays to get your game translated properly.
For as weirdly bright and colorful and goofy, unintentionally probably, as the first Resident Evil game is, it's pretty damn scary. They do a good job at making you feel like you're alone and trapped in this mansion with monsters around every corner. You know, I remember the first time the dogs broke through the window at the beginning of the game. I remember some of the boss encounters really scared the hell out of me. It's a game that it does a good job at making you feel really tense at every moment. Everything you use, every bullet, every healing item feels important, and it feels like if you make the wrong move, if you use the wrong item, you're gonna die. And, you know, again, it helped to popularize an entire genre of horror games that is still super popular today.
This game has spawned so many sequels, not just official sequels, but spin-offs, entirely new games, like Devil May Cry was originally a Resident Evil game. So the influence that this game has had, and not to mention just the sequels to it, there are sequels of different styles. So there's this kind of game that almost isometric, but you know what, tank control, people refer to it. There's the third-person action game, and then there's first-person shooter game, or first-person game. I hesitate to say shooter because that kind of gives you an opinion on it, but it's just been everywhere. And then all the games it's touched, just from an influence perspective, Resident Evil is enormous. Mario RPG was Square and Nintendo working together to put Mario as the star of an RPG, which were somewhat new at the time in popularity. It was a different take on Mario and a successful one. This game would spawn spiritual successors like Paper Mario and Mario and Luigi. Pokemon is maybe the biggest gaming franchise of all time. It might actually be. I can't remember. Pokemon is a monster taming, collecting game that in that concept barely existed at the time, if at all, especially in America. It was a completely new concept. It brought elements of an RPG with like fuzzy animals that kids would like. Setting them on a journey, it was almost like a coming of age story for kids, but with Pokemon, like with the ability to get these like critters to help you out. You don't need me to tell you how huge this game is.
Game Boy was, of course, Nintendo's 8-bit handheld. I don't even know if it was fully 8-bit, but it was Nintendo's handheld, that was introduced in the 80s and lasted a pretty damn long time. People associate Pokemon with the original Game Boy and with the Game Boy brand, but really, like, Pokemon didn't show up till 10 years later. There was a full 10 years where Game Boy existed outside of Pokemon, which is phenomenal, by the way, that a franchise like this even kind of like blew up on a platform that old. But at the time, there weren't really a lot of other handheld choices, and that's just where Pokemon was on the original Game Boy.
The monster taming element is still popular today, and other games have taken it in their own direction, but I don't think anybody's ever like done it better than Pokemon has at whatever point that it did it best. To me, Gen 1 is the best, but other people think Gen 2, whatever. But monster taming is addictive because you get to create the characters that you want to create. So if you wanted a party of this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy, you could do that. And you felt like detached from them, so they weren't you, but they were your friends. Or, I mean, just think about like people's relationship with their pets. Now imagine putting that in a game. There you go. And at the time, there was other things going on, I'm saying Digimon, but it was Tamagotchi, and those kinds of experiences were going on at the same time. So you could tell that there was a yearning for like a digital pet. In this game, you could have 150 of them.
Pokemon is technically an RPG. In a lot of ways, it's baby's first RPG. Pokemon is kind of notorious for being a pretty easy game to cheese your way through, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think that is pretty, accessible for children, which is definitely what they wanted with Pokemon, because the fun of Pokemon isn't, it's like hardcore RPG mechanics. It's the other stuff surrounding it that makes up the rest of the game. But the RPG elements are still notable, and I think that through Pokemon, a lot of people probably got into playing RPGs, moved on to other RPGs because they played the original Pokemon. I mean, I remember getting a Game Boy Color and playing the second generation of Pokemon for the first time, and being confused why I had to stop and hit a button to hit fight, and choose my move. I had never done that before, so it was a way for me to learn how to play an RPG.
Pokemania was rampant, and it's almost, supposedly it's died down, but it's still a big deal, which is crazy considering how long ago this was. This is 30 years ago, and it's just like it has not stopped, which is wild. It's stretched out to card games, it's movies, it's TV shows, all of those things. The card game was arguably just as big as the game, at least for a while. I don't know if it still is, but it certainly was huge at the time. And the TV show was a huge hit. All around, just a smashing success.
The legacy of Pokemon. I mean, nobody ever heard from Pokemon ever again. Kidding. Pokemon is huge. It's still huge. I mean, Pokemon is like the biggest media franchise of all time. You have the anime, you have the card game, you have the video games, you have toys, merchandise, everything under this, phone apps. There's a Pokemon sleep app. It still boggles my mind that you can go to sleep right now and catch Pokemon, apparently. I've never done it, and I don't want to do it, but apparently you can do it. The legacy of Pokemon, it's huge, and it's not going away anytime soon. I don't necessarily like current Pokemon and where they're at, but yet I'm still nostalgic for it because I grew up with it, and I know that's exactly why it's still so big and popular, is because a lot of people like myself grew up playing these original Pokemon games and still love this franchise.
We will change the system.
The Nintendo 64 was Nintendo's next foray into consoles. This was after the Super Nintendo, which was a 16-bit console. The PlayStation was 32. The N64 was 64. I don't know where they got that number, 64. But it represented their ability to leap into, for the most part, 3D gaming and provide a brand new experience. And the jump from Super Nintendo to N64 was maybe the biggest console-to-console jump ever?
The Super Nintendo was a huge success for Nintendo. And for a long time, I think it was their last huge success. Other things were popular until about the Wii, but, the Super Nintendo was big. And it had a lot of great first-party games, had a lot of great third-party games. It was basically the platform to get at the time. And at the end of the Super Nintendo's life, things were kind of rocky for Nintendo moving forward. I mean, a lot of games were moving into 3D. Super Nintendo tried 3D with some games like Star Fox, but then they tried to partner with Sony and then Philips, and they inadvertently made their biggest competition with the PlayStation. Yeah, that's right. The PlayStation came from a deal with Nintendo that went badly. So at the end of the Super Nintendo's life, I'm sure as a consumer you were like, oh man, the next thing from Nintendo is a surefire hit. But I'm sure if you were in the industry, things might have been looking a little rocky at the end there.
Compared to the PlayStation 1, the N64 was a lot more powerful. That being said, it actually, in terms of memory, was a restriction. A cartridge could carry less memory than a disc, which is why a lot of companies actually went with PlayStation at the time instead of the N64. But the N64 could produce, stronger visuals, could produce stronger gameplay. Could do a lot more with that. So it actually was an interesting paradigm because they were around at the same time. One was clearly stronger, but also one was better for storing things, which media became a bigger deal in this era, making this actually a negative almost for the N64.
So the promise of the Ultra 64 is an interesting topic because the Ultra 64 was something that you saw advertised in front of arcade games. Killer Instinct and Cruisin' USA were big ones that had, running on Ultra 64 in the front. And they were marketed as being games that were, in the arcade, that power was going to translate over to the Nintendo 64. And I think the marketing worked. I think it really hyped people up to play some of those games. Did it work out? I don't necessarily think so, because that was sort of a lie. The N64 was not as powerful as those arcade games. But the marketing, I think, worked to veer people over to say, oh man, if I want to play Cruisin' USA or Killer Instinct and all their arcade glory, I got to get myself an N64.
The launch was huge for the N64, especially with Super Mario 64. There were other games that were big too, don't get me wrong. But Super Mario 64 was like opening Pandora's box. It was a completely new experience for most gamers. Nobody had ever seen 3D done right. So it was a completely eye-opening moment for gaming. And just that alone is big. Obviously, numbers-wise, it was a success. But just from the cultural shake that it created of seeing things in 3D, seeing these big worlds that couldn't have existed before, huge.
The Nintendo 64 post-launch is interesting because it's looked back on fondly, and people love the N64. I do. It's like one of my favorite systems of all time. I grew up playing the N64. But it wasn't as popular as the Super Nintendo. And that's because they had lost market share at the time. I mean, the Super Nintendo was the console to get. But by this point, the PlayStation was sort of establishing itself as the console to get. But the N64 still did well, and I think it's very strong catalog of games, and its focus on multiplayer really pushed it to be a big competitor within the industry, and it definitely did better than the next console, the GameCube. So the N64 in a lot of ways is in this middle ground where it wasn't a huge smashing success, but it also wasn't really a failure.
The website GameFAQs would launch this year, and to any RPG fan or anybody who's struggled with the game, they've probably gone to GameFAQs at some point. So we can thank them for that, and this awesome website where people just write long strategy guides to help each other just because. And that's really the spirit of the internet, isn't it?
Nights into Dreams is the Sega game on the Sega Saturn that I could classify closest as being like the premier title, the mascot, the big guy on the Sega Saturn. It's the one that's probably the most memorable. And it was a game about a jester who went into kids' dreams to help them through their troubles. And it had a very cool dreamlike aesthetic and music, and the gameplay was unique. And for the time it was weird, and for now it's weird. Like, there really aren't a lot of games like Nights.
Sega had a problem at this time where they didn't really have a mascot. They had Sonic, but unlike Nintendo, where Mario was always there doing stuff for each console and he was like a presence, Sonic had taken a bit of a backseat. They hadn't really struck gold with Sonic. And so there wasn't really a strong mascot at the time. And they always thought that people needed to identify a mascot to a console, to a company. So that, like, Nintendo was Mario. Sony was, not really one there either. I guess Crash Bandicoot was theirs, maybe? But Sega didn't really have a hit at the moment. So they were looking for something to step up and represent Sega.
Sonic Team, of course, is a team made up of people that make Sonic games. That's what they were formed to do. Back on the original Genesis, they made Sonic the Hedgehog games. And I should know because I'm the Sonic guy, but by this point, I suspect that Yuji Naka and the Sonic folk were kind of tired of making Sonic games by this point, because the Saturn didn't really have a Sonic game. They're call its own. It had Sonic games, but not like the Sonic game. But kind of Knights filled that spot, and this seemed to be like where they shifted their focus after the Genesis. And I like that. I like the fact that they decided to kind of refresh and do something new. Knights as a character probably isn't as iconic as Sonic, but Knights is an iconic character. A lot of people can name Knights, and it is because of its unique visual style and characteristics.
Knights had this mesmerizing look to it. Nothing really looked like it at the time. PlayStation was starting to go there, but it was this movement where it was side-scrolling, but it was fluid, and it followed him and did all these tricks with it, and there was so much glittering going on, and for lack of a better term, it was very dreamlike and colorful. So it was very unique looking at the time. Not many games looked like that, and so it stood out.
Knights worked with the Saturn 3D controller. I don't have one, sadly, so I can't hold it up for you like I usually do, but Editing Spencer can put it on screen here. The Saturn 3D controller was a controller with a 3D analog stick, something that the original Saturn controller didn't have, which worked well in Knights and was kind of crafted for Knights, because in Knights you fly around on a 2D plane, and you fly through rings, and it's kind of like arcadey. You want to get the best time and best points, and you want to do loop-de-loops, in the air while you're flying around. It really feels very free while you're playing. So the 3D controller is essentially the best way to play the game. I mean, you can play it without it, but I wouldn't recommend that. It's the best way to play the game because it gives you that free movement in the air, and it really makes you feel like you're flying. It works, and the 3D controller for the Sega Saturn went on to inspire the Dreamcast controller. Now, if that's a good or bad thing is up to you, but it did.
In the Sega Pantheon, I feel like this game has never fully gotten everything that it deserved. I feel like it should have had more sequels. I feel like people should have taken it in more interesting directions, which they did some. But you would think that at this point, it would be up there with Sonic, and it just isn't. It's nowhere near that. So it's almost like a well-kept secret that people that know love it, and everyone else is like, that's weird that Sega made something that isn't Sonic. Valve is one of the most prolific gaming companies of all time. They head up Steam. I guess they manage it. They own it. They do whatever they do with Steam, which is the PC, the go-to PC gaming space that they started the online store. That was them for gaming. They also make games that are actually almost always incredibly good and influential. So they're a weird piece of gaming where they're always good. It's weird. Valve.
I feel like we're going to talk about Valve every time Valve comes up. We're going to talk about how amazing their games are. And their games were amazing. Valve went on to make some of the best games in the industry. Games like Half-Life, games like Portal, games like Left 4 Dead, like Counter-Strike, Team Fortress 2. Valve made some of the best games in the industry, which is crazy because they really only made games for a pretty short period of time in terms of how long gaming's been around, but they made that much of an impact that whenever I think of Valve, I still think of these landmark titles.
Steam is so important to PC gaming. They started like the online store that it had technically been tried before, but never successfully. Now, granted, their advantage was they were on PC, so they didn't have to deal with all the console nonsense. But still, they spearheaded it, and they created the filters, everything that we think is normal now. They started, and throughout all of time, they've been the most reliable. They have competitors. They have people that they have. There's other versions of it that are better, theoretically, but they've stood the test of time, and they've been here the whole time. So they're known as the owners of the PC gaming space.
PC gaming at this time was a lot different than it is now. Now there's more cross between PC and console, to a point to where consoles are basically PCs and console games go to PC and vice versa. And there's now PCs that are consoles. It's crazy. But at the time, the markets couldn't be more different. If you were like somebody that played on PC, the types of games you were playing and the experiences you were having weren't even close to what was going on console. I'm not saying one was better than the other, but they were just worlds apart. And you know, Valve was entering into that market, and I think in a lot of ways Valve revolutionized some of the PC gaming market and brought it closer together. But yeah, there was a big divide at that time with console and PC.
Gabe Newell, I have made fun of personally so much for being so fat, but he is truly an incredible leader, a very smart man, and somebody that you should think of as like an oracle for gaming and just for things in general. He's done a lot of philanthropic things as well that are really interesting, but he's a very interesting man that we're lucky to have in the gaming space. And we owe him a lot. I personally think. I owe him a lot. I've given him a lot too.
And today, Valve is known for Steam, and Steam is Steam, and you know what Steam is. It's the biggest gaming platform on PC. It's a marketplace where you could buy games, and it's huge. It's fucking huge. And of course, Steam now has its own consoles that are basically PCs, but as console, like the Steam Deck, and now they're doing the Steam Machine, and they're like a VR thing. Like, yeah. Steam is huge because Valve took a lot of what they learned from their early successes and put it towards this brand and this style. And, I wouldn't be surprised if Steam takes over a lot of companies. And, I don't see Xbox being around for much longer. So who knows? Maybe Steam's the next big competitor.
X-Men vs. Street Fighter releases, which combines the Marvel characters with the Capcom fighting game and became one of the strongest brands for Capcom. The Versus series would go on to be a huge deal with the Marvel vs. Capcom and other Versus titles coming out later. It all started here with X-Men vs. Street Fighter in 1996.
Crash Bandicoot is the PlayStation mascot platformer. It is the mascot platformer. Unless you're a Spyro the Dragon fan, you're really mad at me right now. But Crash Bandicoot was the showcase for the original PlayStation. It showed that you could have a fun, colorful 3D platformer that could rival Mario 64, could look technically impressive for the time, and had such a unique style and footprint that it also went on to inspire a whole type of character and genre. And yeah, Naughty Dog basically not. I mean, it's the first notable game by Naughty Dog, and you know who Naughty Dog is. They made The Last of Us, and Sony can't stop selling you The Last of Us, so you definitely know who this company is.
This was like the first successful PS1 take on platformers in like a 3D-ish space. So the PlayStation 1 couldn't perform as well as the N64, but they could create that like hallway look, and this game did that exceptionally well. And they were able to do some other stuff with it too, but for the most part, this translated from almost a 2D plus 3D element together, and in some ways it was better than Mario 64 in some ways. But they handled 3D platforming in a completely different way.
Naughty Dog before this game had a few titles, but this was really where they, grew into what they are today with Crash Bandicoot and its sequels. And Naughty Dog went on to be one of the biggest studios for PlayStation, creating games after Crash Bandicoot like Jak and Daxter, Uncharted, The Last of Us Part 2, the controversial one, and now they're doing Heretic, I forget what it's called, Intergalactic, the Heretic Prophet or some shit. I forget what it's called, but they're doing another game, and like I'm sure it's going to be huge, and Naughty Dog is just one of those studios now that whenever they make a game, you pay attention to it. Even if it's not something you're particularly interested in, you pay attention because they're one of those studios that often redefine what games are for a generation. And, it all started here with the first Crash Bandicoot.
Much like Sega, the PlayStation was also having a mascot problem, and Crash Bandicoot actually fit this bill perfectly. He was a little more edgy than Mario, but he was still family friendly. You could still put him with the kids and it would be perfectly fine. He was just a little bit more edgy, maybe in the same realm as Sonic, but he fit the bill of a mascot, even though it wasn't first party.
PlayStation 1 versus N64 was the point and contention of many battles on the playground as a kid. A lot of kids loved the PlayStation and its brand and its catalog of games. A lot of people love the N64 and its brand and its catalog of games. And, for every game on the N64, there was a game you could compare it to on the PlayStation. And for every kid that brought up Mario 64 on the Nintendo 64, there was going to be a kid bringing up Crash Bandicoot. Because Crash Bandicoot really did have that much staying power at the time. It really was that big of a deal. I mean, it was that big of a brand. The commercials were huge. The marketing was huge. Just the character himself, Crash Bandicoot, was such a lovable character that, in many ways at the time, he could dethrone Mario in a lot of ways. And I bet you a lot of kids use Crash Bandicoot as their smoking gun.
Crash Bandicoot on the PS1 would expand to 2 more sequels and a racing game that would rival Mario Kart. Some people like it more than Mario Kart. They're wrong. But some people do like it, and I would say that the Naughty Dog legacy of Crash Bandicoot is very, very good and untouched in a lot of ways. As soon as it left Naughty Dog's hands, I would argue the quality changed, but those 3 on the PS1 were solid. Wow. 1996 was one crazy year. If you hated it, make sure you check out our We Hate video for 1996, where we talk about all the crap that was in that year. But if you liked it, then just give us a like, give us a subscribe, and let us know how we did. See if we missed anything. That's all I can think of. Anything else, Alex?
Looking through my Saturn games. We're going to talk about a lot of Saturn stuff this episode. Where is it? Ooh, Resident Evil. No, that's not. Sonic R? No, that's not what I'm looking for. Shining Wisdom. Oh, here it is. Tomb Raiders. I like this cover. I definitely like this cover a lot more. Look at that. I wonder why.